What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and in today's episode of the third person and action RPG tutorial series, we're going to be going over improving our equipment, items, weapons quite a bit, and significantly improving our look at system, or simplifying it really, because what we want to be able to do is look at an item, such as the helmet, or a weapon, like the sword, or an item, like our potions over here, and equip them. And we can kind of do that now with what we set up in the previous episodes for our look at interaction. But there's a few pieces missing. One thing is it doesn't support both look at and overlap interactions, which I would like to support in the series. So for example, if I am looking at an item but I'm overlapping another one, I can prioritize the item I am looking at over the item I'm overlapping with. The reason this is important is because say I'm in a pool of loot, there's two things on top of each other, like this case here. We have the axe and the dagger. If I am to look at one directly, I can then allow the player or the character to interact with that one instead of whatever one is closest to them or whatever the case may be, which will stop any annoyances with loot in the same area, and it will give more control back to the user. One thing we can do to make this process a little bit easier is make the items, equipment, and weapons closer together. Right now they're all kind of their own thing. They all have a base parent of default item, but things like the mesh and the interaction box are actually set up on the default item BP, the default weapon BP, and the default equipment BP, which means anytime we want to treat these items generically, we still have to cast to the specific type and grab the corresponding mesh or interaction box, instead of just doing it from one place, which would make our lives a lot easier. So we're going to be improving that system vastly. We're going to be converting logic to code, which is nice for performance, and we're going to be improving our interaction system, all in today's episode. So if you want to get caught up in the entire series of the third-person action RPG tutorial series and see how we've done things like NPCs and interacting with them, melee attacks, experience, special animations, and commands, you can see all that in the playlist for the third-person and action RPG tutorial series. Alternatively, if you don't care about the entire series and you just care about interaction, that's perfectly fine. You don't have to follow the whole series to follow the interaction episodes, but I still recommend that before watching this episode, you look at the other interaction episodes that we've done in the series, because we are going to be building on that system today. So if you've followed the previous episodes, you will be able to follow this episode a lot more easily. With that out of the way, we're good to go. But this is a code and blueprint tutorial series, and we're going to be doing all of our logic in the code today, and we'll be removing some things that we had in the blueprint and resetting some things that we had in the blueprint as well to use that code version, which will speed up our game, but also bring us a lot closer to what I was talking about earlier, where all these items retain their uniqueness, but also share a lot more of the common traits, so we don't have to do as much work every time we want to use them throughout our code. So let's go into the code, and specifically I want to go to my default item.h. So default item is my base item class for my project. So items are potions, weapons, equipment, and probably other things too. But this is the base class for all of them. This is the parent class. What I want to do is set up any of the shared components that we're going to have for our default item, as well as our default weapon, our default equipment. Because right now, the way it works is we have a default item, and then we have a blueprint for default or base item BP. And then in here we had a static mesh and an interaction box. And this was perfectly fine, but the other blueprints, let's say our base weapon BP, also needed their own version of the weapon mesh, the damage collider, and the interaction box. If we set these things up in the code, since all of their parents, one way or another, derive from base item or default item, all of these classes will have a mesh and interaction box. And for all weapons, they will have a damage collider. So going into our default item.h again, I've gone down to the bottom of my function and variable list, and I've made two components in this class. So I'm assuming that everything that is a default item or a child of a default item will have a mesh and an interaction box. The mesh is what we display the item as, so if it's a potion, it could be a flask. If it's our weapon, it could be something like a sword. The interaction box is how we can interact with this item. We can change the dimensions to interact, make it easier for bigger items to be interacted with and smaller items to be interacted with. So the first one here, we have class uStaticMesh component pointer, and I've called it item mesh. It's important that you don't call this the same thing as what is in your blueprint now. So for my default item or my base item BP, I had a static mesh called static mesh. Then I had a box collider or box component that was called interaction box. If you name these variables the same thing as what you saw in the blueprint, you will get an error because you can't have two components of the same type at the same spot in the hierarchy with the same name. So I called it item mesh and item interaction box. You can always call them whatever for now, and then when we convert over to using the code one later in this episode, you can remove the blueprint one and rename it. So use static mesh component. It will just support a mesh just like we have in the blueprint, and I'm calling it item mesh again. The class in front is a forward declare. This basically means we can access this type without including the file for a static mesh component. There's a little bit more to it than that. It is set to U property of edit anywhere blueprint read write, which just means we can see it, edit it in the blueprint, and the details and the graphs. It has a category of item, and I'm setting meta equals allow private access equals true because these are components that are in the protected space, but I still want to be able to edit them on the blueprint side of things. Doesn't mean I want them to be public variables, so this meta tag does exactly that. The next one is the same exact U property, and it is our box component. So U box component pointer, item interaction box, and I put that class in there to forward declare it. So now we have our components that we want our item to be. If we go into default item.cpp and go to our constructor where we set the default values for all of our items, I go to above where I set my default values for variables because it just makes more sense for me this way. And I want to create and attach all of my components. The first one we want is our root component. You technically don't need to set your root component because it will be set to a value by default, but if you don't set it manually, the engine is going to have to do some things on its own, which could change the way your setup works. So we're going to create the root component. Now, root component is a variable that all actors have. A default item is a child of a actor, which means it has this root component. So we can just say root component equals, and we're going to create a new object. So create default object, then I have angled brackets for the type, because we have to determine what type of object we're creating, and we're creating a uScene component for our root component. That's one of the highest levels, so it makes it very generic and gives us a lot of functionality that these scene components are going to want. This next part is the name, so we use the text macro and put in root component. What this does is set the actual name in parentheses here, so it's a more common name if you want to name it something like that. Typically I just name it the same thing or something very close, but it's up to you what you do with it. For the next one, I want to create and attach my static mesh component. So we have our item mesh variable here, and I'm going to create a default subobject. This time it's going to be a uStaticMesh component. And for the text, I've named it item static mesh. You could also put a skeletal mesh here instead if you have skeletons for your items, which is something that's very possible to have and do. And we will probably explore them at some point in the series. The root component being set automatically is known by the actor and by the blueprint that this is the head component, but for child components, we need to set them. So item mesh, arrow, setup attachment, and we're going to set it to root component. So basically make this a child of this, or make item mesh a child of root component. The other one that we need is the interaction box or our box collision component. So item interaction box equals create default subobject. We want to use uBox component. And for the text, I have item interaction box. Then we say item interaction box setup attachment, passing in item mesh, which means the interaction box is the child of the mesh. In the blueprint, this is how we had it set up for items, so I just followed that. Technically, you don't need the interaction box to be a child of the mesh, but I recommend that you do, because you can still scale the interaction box, so if you want it to be a different size, like bigger or smaller than the mesh, you can. But then as you change things about the mesh, some details will automatically be passed down to the interaction box. So I do recommend it, but it's not required. And there we go. Now our default item has these components built into it, so all children will also have these components inherited. To include this box component type, by the way, you can go up to the top and do #include components /box component.h. that will give us access to that type. We can go in and start assigning these values to our blueprints, but there's another case as well, and that is the damage collider on the weapon. So if we go to base weapon again, base weapon BP specifically, in here in the component list we have weapon mesh and damage collider, then interaction box. The damage collider is what part of the weapon actually deals damage when performing an attack. Now you may have hitboxes or other systems, but if you are going to use actual damage colliders or these box collision components on your weapon, then we want to include this as well. Now this is specific to base weapon BP. Similar to the item, if we want to translate that and put it in the code, we need to go to defaultweapon.h and scroll down. Here in the protected space, I am making another box component. This is the same new property as before, but edit anywhere blueprint read write, I've changed the category to weapon, since this is specific to weapons, and then same meta. Meta equals allow private access equals true. Class ubox component pointer weapon damage box. Now in default weapon.cpp, I go up to above where we set our values for the variables, and I say weapon damage box equals create default subobject. And for the type, I use ubox component. Remember, you have to have this include to do that. So include component / box component.h. Then we need to name it. So text weapon damage box. And I attach this directly to the item mesh, which is in the parent class. It's the mesh for our item that we made. So now in our new system, we have the mesh as the parent, and the weapon damage box and the interaction box are both children of the mesh. Now, equipment doesn't have anything special that we need to change for the code today, but if we take a look at base equipment BP while we're in here, I do want to note that the equipment already had a skeletal mesh that we added onto this blueprint. We didn't use it for anything, but we added the option in case we wanted to have a skeletal mesh in the future for our equipment. We're not going to need to put this in right now. If we start using skeletal meshes for any sort of legendary equipment or whatever the case may be, we will add it then. I'm actually going to delete the equipment skeletal mesh just to make lives a little bit easier while watching this episode. We didn't use it, there's no issue. If you're using it now, of course, don't delete it. That's perfectly fine. But for me, I'm not using it. All my stuff for my meshes is the static mesh type. So now we have our base item BP, base weapon BP, and base equipment BP. And our code is matching what we have in those blueprints now. So at this point, we can close and relaunch the editor, or we can just hot reload or live code, however you get your changes from code to blueprint. I've already done mine because I'd set up that logic prior to the episode. So now I want to go into base item BP and start cleaning it up. So the next thing that I have to do is move over my details for all of my components to the code ones. So in base item BP, for example, if I had any default values in here, such as collision presets, I set the collision presets to overlap all. I know this because there is the undo arrow here, which means we can reset it back to the default value. So if this is present, this means we edited it, or something that we changed has edited it. So in my case, I want to go to my item mesh here and set the collision presets to overlap all, which I've already done this. But just make sure that anything you've changed on the blueprint side does get converted over here to the code component. And you can do this in code as well if you want. You've seen me do it before in some of my other episodes if you've been watching. But for now, it's fine. You can just set this in blueprint. You don't have to set the collision presets in code. You can still set it on the blueprint even though it's a code-created component. And same for the interaction box, so anything you've set in here should be transferred as well. Now the only thing I set in here was I changed collision presets to custom, and everything's overlap except visibility, which is block. So we want to make sure our item interaction box on the code side matches as well. You can see custom, everything is overlap except visibility, which is block. And I'll go through this quickly. If you want to pause it, you can look at my settings, but I promise I haven't changed anything in any of these. I just made them match up. Now the root component, you likely can't see anything in here because there's nothing to edit or add. That's perfectly fine. This is our container. Just make sure that it exists. If you're having any issues seeing any of your components here or getting the details panel to pop up, make sure you click on class defaults here to see it. So if I click class defaults and then click on my mesh, I should see it here. If you still can't see it after that, Unreal does have a bug where sometimes when you are changing the name of components or changing the hierarchy of components in code, and that blueprint class that you're in has already had components with either the same name or had a different structure in it, that it won't show these details properly. There's a few fixes. You could just make the blueprint again and copy everything over, but that's a lot of work. Much easier fix is to just change the parent class. So if we go to class settings and go to parent class and change it to actor, for example, it will clear out everything that's in here that comes from the inherited list, and then we can change it back to default item, and it will bring everything back. Now when you do this, it will reset everything that was not set in the code. So only do this if you need to. You don't have to do it just because. Only do it if you can't see the details here. But now I set everything back for base item BP. Next one we have to tackle is base weapon BP. So we can come in here. Now this is the same deal. You want to transfer everything from your weapon mesh to your item mesh, your interaction box to your item interaction box, and now your damage collider to your weapon damage box. So I'll quickly scroll through this so that you can see I've set the weapon mesh to no collision. And I have the damage collider here, which has an overlap all collision. Item mesh, we want to scroll down and set this to no collision if we want it to match. And our weapon damage box, we want to set this to overlap all, which it already is. Then for interaction box, we want it to be custom with visibility on block, everything else overlap. File and save. Now same with the equipment. We have our equipment static mesh, which we've set to be no collision and character cannot step up on it, and we don't generate overlap events. And for the interaction box, we have it set to the same collision presets as the others with no additional changes. So we want to go to our item mesh and set this up the same. So no collision, can character step up on no, and don't generate overlap events. And then item interaction box is going to be custom with visibility on block. So there we go. Now all of our items follow that standard. Next we have to go into every single one of these and just make sure that they match what we had on the blueprint components. So I'm going to quickly go through this and just scroll through it, and I'll speed this up. So there we go, guys. We've converted these components from blueprints to code, which has unified our system. And in the next episode, we're going to be going over using this unified system to improve our lookat interactions, and we'll finally get that working as well. So then everything with overlap and lookat interactions will be working together for the first time in this series. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please subscribe. It does more for myself and the channel than anything else you can do, and I appreciate it. If you'd like to support the channel further, you can support me on Patreon, YouTube membership, or Discord subscriptions to get some extra benefits and throw more support my way. Thank you very much to all the wonderful people who already have. I'm very, very grateful for you. If you ran into any problems while following this tutorial or any of my tutorials, feel free to join the Discord community. The support is completely free, and I'd be happy to help you. Anyway, guys, that's all I got. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, guys.